Many Bleach fans, myself included, hold the final battle between Ichigo and Ulquiorra in some kind of reverence, with many people considering it to be the absolute pinnacle of all Bleach fights, and it's really not hard to see why. The final battle between these two towards the end of the Uryu arc is a long and brutal affair, and includes some of Bleach's absolute darkest moments. This fight does a really good job of upending many of the stereotypical tropes of the series and the genre as a whole. For instance, Ichigo is a character who can often get back up on his feet when being beaten down and eventually overcome overwhelming odds, but Ulquiorra is a very different character, and Kubo handles this villain differently, and because of that the fight feels very different as well. What happens when Ichigo finally comes up against an opponent who, no matter how many times he gets back up on his feet, he cannot overcome? And it leads to a fight that feels very different from many others, particularly in the second half. And that second half is what I really want to look at in this video today. Despite being officially known as the Lust mini-arc during the story itself, it became known among fans as the Dome or Above the Dome, because of the fact it is set above the dome of Las Noches, and it makes the fight feel very different with a dramatically different atmosphere to many other battles. But crucially, this is the moment where Ichigo dies. Of all the mini self-contained story moments in the series, I really do believe that the Dome sat with fans for a very long time. It's definitely not something anyone ever really forgot. It's powerful, emotional, and punchy, and really does feel very different from a lot in the series. And I really want to examine this mini-arc in this video today, look at what I consider to maybe be the darkest scene in all of Bleach, and really look at what Kubo did to make the Dome so memorable. Before we kick things off, I just want to give a huge thanks to all of you guys who helped us reach 40,000 subs before the end of the year. That is just fantastic. If you do love Bleach and you haven't subbed yet, this is the perfect place for you to be in, with videos like this coming out every single week, so make sure to hit that button now. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up as well, because it really helps with the exposure on the channel, and also hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all of my videos. So to see why the Dome made such an impact among fans, I think it's important to look at the context surrounding it and how this fight actually begins. Ichigo versus Ulquiorra obviously brought with it a lot of hype. Ulquiorra wasn't really a rival to Ichigo in the same way as Grimmjow was. He was more an unassailable target, a mountain that Ichigo had to climb, similar to Byakuya but handled differently in the end. Now, the fight starts out as a pretty typical battle in the Uryu arc, with an awful lot of stuff going on, and the stakes themselves don't feel too high just yet. Yami arrives, Uryu arrives, Loli and Menali turn up, and to be honest, it's just an absolute crazy skirmish. However, Ulquiorra eventually leads Ichigo above the dome itself, breaking through the fake sky of Las Noches to take the battle above, and this is when the atmosphere changes dramatically. What's interesting to note about the fight before this moment, however, is that while it does feel like a traditional battle in this arc, there is an unmistakable sense of foreboding here, the feeling that Ichigo is already outmatched despite trying his absolute best. There's no doubt that Ichigo has improved since his last encounter with Ulquiorra, and he manages to pull off some pretty nice moves, such as when he grabs Ulquiorra's wrist and reads his attacks and then lands a big hit on his chest. However, Ulquiorra is barely harmed by this, and we can already see that Ichigo is going up against someone who maybe he actually can't defeat. That sense of impending doom is integral to this battle and carries on throughout the rest of the fight until the moment we're going to talk about. One thing I want to point out as well about the atmosphere is that a lot of the battles with the Espada throughout the entire series are set during the daytime, and of course it's artificial daytime being in Las Noches or they're in the fake Karakura town, but nearly every single one I think is set during the day. However, the second half of the fight with Ulquiorra is set in a pitch black void, the true Hueco Mundo if you will, and I find that to be really fascinating, as I think the darkness obviously fits the atmosphere perfectly, but it also suits Ulquiorra's nihilistic viewpoint of the world and the void that he seeks. This real, crushing darkness of the battlefield that Ichigo finds himself in represents not only Ulquiorra very well, but the hopelessness at the centre of this battle. I think the reason fans singled out the Above the Dome stuff as being its own self-isolated mini-story is the way Kubo approaches storytelling during this segment of the fight, and honestly it's really interesting and quite refreshing going back now and rereading this little section, because he does some creative things with his approach to the story. For the most part though, the fight does carry on as normal. Ulquiorra however activates his Resurrection, having not been allowed to do so beneath the dome of Las Noches beforehand, and reveals his new power Murcielago. and he begins to basically just absolutely wail on Ichigo as the gulf between their power becomes immediately clear. Now, going back briefly to talk about how Kubo changes up his storytelling during this mini-arc, I want to address the side characters involved as well. Now, the Dome only focuses on 4 central characters: Ichigo, Ulquiorra, Orihime, and Uryu. And we get to see briefly Orihime and Uryu's viewpoint, as obviously they've been left far below and the fight has carried on above the Dome, and Orihime requests to be taken above by Uryu. And what's really, really interesting here is that Kubo actually makes Uryu the narrator very briefly here, almost making him a conduit for the reader. We know something bad is about to go down, and seemingly so does Uryu. And this really is something that Kubo has never really done before. We get a bit of Uryu's perspective where we're almost seeing Orihime through his eyes, and he says that while he could never turn her down, he knows he shouldn't have, and he would immediately come to regret agreeing to take her above. And it is like Kubo is writing almost a novel in this scene. Kubo is telling us how Uryu feels directly. Uryu is saying, you know, I would immediately regret taking Orihime above. And this is something that never really happens again in the series, and I find it really fascinating, actually, and it's obviously a prelude to the fact that Ichigo suffers the worst fate he can and dies in this battle. But it's such a nice way of doing foreshadowing, foreboding, and creating this feeling of dread that I think this fight evokes so well. Another way the fight evokes dread well is through the use of black, and Kubo uses black incredibly well in this battle. When Uryu and Orihime are travelling upwards, they are suddenly assaulted by what feels like a vast ocean of black Reiatsu that's just absolutely like crushing their bodies as they try and rise up through it. And this is of course when Ulquiorra activates his Segunda Etapa, still one of the coolest designs in the series as far as I'm concerned. Ulquiorra's second form represents more than just a power-up, though. It is, as he says, true despair and a real symbol of the hopelessness that Ichigo now faces. Ulquiorra's second form is evidence of the fact that Ichigo's indomitable spirit doesn't always mean he will win. And Ulquiorra in this form just absolutely demolishes Ichigo, throwing him around, smashing him through buildings, and Ichigo never gains the upper hand again. What's interesting though is that Ichigo never actually gives up hope here, and he always does try and rise back onto his feet to carry on fighting Ulquiorra. And I always find it interesting as well that Ichigo doesn't give up hope here, but he does give up hope against Aizen, and he does give up hope against Yhwach later on, despite the fact that I would argue those situations never really feel as bad as this one. There always feels like there's an out in those situations. Something generally presents itself to Ichigo to eventually help him win. But in this fight, nothing does, and I think that's what's so powerful about this battle, is that it is completely isolated. Of all the people there that can fight Ulquiorra, Ichigo really is the only one, and as soon as he starts to struggle, who else is going to arrive to save them? And that's what I think is so powerful about this fight scene, and why the stuff above the Dome really did stick with fans forever. Before we move on to Ichigo's actual death, I just want to bring up Kubo's art during this scene, and in my opinion, the wounds in Bleach never look as painful as they do in this scene. And obviously that might feel a bit ridiculous because people get arms ripped off and bodies cut in half and stuff like that. But here, there's something so raw about that cut going across Ichigo's face that it's just like leaking blood. And he looks truly injured. Like, he looks like he's in real pain. Like that, you know, makes me wince, that cut on his face. It looks painful. And Kubo's definitely doing this on purpose, again, to illustrate just how outmatched Ichigo is and how he cannot cope against Ulquiorra's second form. Orihime arrives and Ulquiorra takes the moment to kill Ichigo, blasting him point blank through the chest with a Cero Osculus, just completely removing his heart and just about everything else that should be there. It is a crazy moment that completely defies the standard trope of just getting back up on your feet against insurmountable odds and eventually winning. And it is a situation that Ichigo is never put in again, really, by any villain. Although they do have their own ways of breaking his spirit, I truly do feel like this is probably he dies, so it is the worst situation he's really ever put in, and that's why it's so fascinating to me. Now, I know a lot of people back in the day especially found Orihime to be pretty annoying during this scene, with her constant crying and shouting about Ichigo and how she doesn't know what to do without him being there. But on a reread, I do think it conveys the hopelessness of the situation very well, especially when combined with Uryu's vain attempts to fight Ulquiorra after Ichigo's been killed. And I absolutely love the way Ulquiorra says to Uryu, I thought you were supposed to be the calm one, and Uryu's face, again, is drawn so well. He's clearly, like, just contorted with emotion, but still managing to compose himself, and he is running into what is almost certain death against Ulquiorra's Segunda Etapa, seeing him lose his hand in the manga, and then get knocked backwards, and Orihime's trying to heal, obviously dead Ichigo, but trying to heal Uryu at the same time, and Ulquiorra's just advancing on all of them, and I think it's more hopelessness than has ever been felt before in the series, and I think it's really, and honestly is ever felt again. That crushing darkness surrounding them, Ulquiorra almost looking like the devil incarnate himself as well, is really powerful. And then we know, of course, that Ichigo's hollow, or Zangetsu himself, takes over Ichigo's body and brings out this monstrous new form that helps Ichigo defeat Ulquiorra. And I actually really like this, because I really like that it closes a plot thread that was opened up way earlier in the arc as well, when Ichigo defeats Zangetsu, and Zangetsu says to him that, if you ever die, I will crush your body and take over. And he does that. His raw instinct comes out here and just completely envelops Ichigo's body, completely turning him into something he is not, something completely different. But from a literary standpoint, the dome sequence, in my opinion, probably is the darkest scene in Bleach. Ichigo, his will is failing him, his body is failing him, and his powers are as well, and he's just come up against an opponent who does embody true despair, something he cannot overcome with strength alone and will alone, and I think it's really powerful. I think what helps the dome stand out as well is that it is considerably darker than anything that immediately follows it. The rest of the Fate Karakura Town arc is considerably more traditional in its execution. The bad guys look like they're winning, but then the good guys come back and kill all the Espada. And again, the fights are set in daytime. We kind of revert back to that more traditional Espada setting, that more traditional feeling Espada battle. The Ulquiorra fight really does stand alone, in my opinion, as a truly unique fight in the Arrancar arc. And one thing I've always loved about the battle on the dome is how it does turn into this almost infernal fight between demons. Both Ichigo and Ulquiorra look completely demonic once Ichigo is transformed, and the explosions created by their attacks cause like walls of fire to appear behind them, and Ichigo is very clearly supposed to look demonic in this scene, but Ulquiorra does as well, and you get the feeling that this is like a battle in hell between these two characters, and it's really powerful, and this is one of the main reasons why this fight is so highly regarded among fans, because of the imagery evoked is so powerful. But I think Kubo does great character work in this fight as well that really helped it stand out for readers as well. The way Ulquiorra, despite being instrumental in Ichigo's death, is actually humanized in this fight, which is such a unique way of taking that character, despite the fact he has committed this unspeakable act, this emotionless, hollow act of killing Ichigo when he's defenseless and Orihime has just arrived. And then obviously later on, Ichigo pins Ulquiorra down with his foot and then goes to hit him with a Cero, and Ulquiorra says, how very hollow-like of you. So I love the way Kubo plays with those themes there. It is the ultimate transgression for Ichigo, someone who has been moving towards a more hollow-like state throughout the entirety of the Arrancar arc, has finally reached the apex of that moment. And he is this merciless, mindless beast who eventually obviously turns on Uryu as well and attacks his friend. But I love the way, despite the fact that Ulquiorra is the bad guy here, he never really feels like it as the fight reaches its conclusion. I think Kubo just does a phenomenal job with that, and that's why sometimes these isolated mini story arcs are often the best written in Bleach, because they're not quite so grandiose. The stakes feel smaller but also feel larger at the same time. There's less characters involved. And I love the way Kubo does that. He plays a nice role reversal. Ulquiorra's the bad guy, but he gets humanized. Ichigo's supposed to be the good guy, but he becomes a monstrous beast who even attacks his friends. And Ulquiorra even saves the day in the end by cutting off Ichigo's horn just as he's about to attack Uryu. However, perhaps my favourite thing about the dome, and the reason why I think it feels so dark in comparison to everything else, and dark can sometimes be such a meaningless word. It's thrown around an awful lot these days. It feels a bit arbitrary, but I think it does apply here. And the reason I think it applies here is because it has such a profound mental effect on Orihime. Bleach has I would call it a slight problem, in my opinion, that it doesn't reference old events particularly often. I think one of the worst examples is the Fullbring arc, which just never brought up again, despite the fact it has such a traumatic effect on Ichigo and his friends. But the dome is brought up again, and I think that's really powerful, and it shows just how emotional this event was. It actually brought up twice for Orihime, so you can see how clearly affected by it she was. It's brought up once in the Lost Agent arc when Riruka says to her, what are you going to do if Ichigo can't be healed? What if he's injured beyond repair? And Orihime, you know, now defiant, says that I will never allow that to happen again. And she has a minor flashback to Ichigo being killed. Really powerful stuff. And then much later on, right at the end of the series, just as Ichigo activates his final transformation against Yhwach and gains an appearance with the horn slightly similar to the monstrous form he gets here, Orihime is briefly very worried that he is transformed into this monster again, but Ichigo's like, I'm me, don't worry about it. And I think that continuity is just so good, and that the dome clearly had a resounding effect on Orihime in particular, but also Ichigo, because when he eventually confronts Tensa Zangetsu at the end of the Arrancar arc to learn the final Getsuga Tensho, he sees his hollow form, where he sees Zangetsu as the monstrous form that killed Ulquiorra, and that's the thing that's scaring him into not being able to use his hollow powers properly against, like, Yami, for instance. So I love the way the dome has a knock-on effect to major characters in the series. Kind of wish we got something from Uryu, but we don't really. But Ulquiorra's death as well is very emotional. I want to talk about Ichigo versus Ulquiorra as a whole another time. But for now, this dark scene where Ichigo dies and just the above the dome stuff in general, where the atmosphere is very different and has such a knock-on effect to the characters in the rest of the story, I love it. But those are just my thoughts after revisiting the Lust arc in the Arrancar arc, or, you know, the dome stuff, this mini story arc there, where Ichigo is killed by Ulquiorra. So what do you think of this section of the story? Did it have an effect on you when you were reading it back in the day, or if you've read it recently? Revisiting it now, I remember why it was so powerful and why it was such a popular moment as well, and why that fight has gone down in history as being one of Bleach's best. Alright guys, but until next time, I shall catch you later. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you then. Goodbye.